Sometimes the night feels like it has secrets it will never tell in daylight. It leans close with its shadows and silences, asking us to listen. And before we step into this story, I want you to hear this truth. You are loved, here and now, just as you are. You are cared for in ways you might not always see, but in this moment let yourself feel it. This story is a hand reaching out, gentle, steady, waiting only for yours. And together, we'll walk slowly, softly, through pages that feel more like dreams than words. Before we begin the story, tell us, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it there? Now grab your coffee and let's get started. Sometimes the night feels like it has secrets it will never tell in daylight. It leans close with its shadows and silences, asking us to listen. And before we step into this story, I want you to hear this truth. You are loved here and now just as you are. You are cared for in ways you might not always see. But in this moment, let yourself feel it. This story is a hand reaching out, gentle, steady, waiting only for yours. And together, we'll walk slowly, softly, through pages that feel more like dreams than words. Before we begin the story, tell us, where in the world are you watching from and what time is it there? Now grab your coffee and let's get started. It began with a sound that wasn't supposed to be there. A boy, no more than 8, sat cross-legged on the floor of his room, fiddling with a battered old radio his grandfather had left behind. Its knobs were loose, its antenna bent, its wooden casing chipped by years of weather and hands. The radio didn't really play music anymore, just static, a soft rushing like wind through tall grass. But that night, deep in the quiet, when even the house seemed to be holding its breath, the static shaped itself into something else, a voice. It wasn't loud, it wasn't clear. It rose and fell like a whisper breaking on water. But the boy heard it, and though he couldn't catch every word, he knew it was speaking to him. The sound was fragile, trembling, as though carried across oceans of silence. And though he couldn't understand the language, he understood the feeling. It was a call, soft and lonely, waiting to be answered. He pressed his ear closer. The radio hummed warmly, as though alive. For a moment he wondered if it was his grandfather's voice, because hadn't his grandfather once told him that stars could hide inside bottles, that memories never truly vanished, they only changed shape? The boy wanted to believe it. That, somehow across time, his grandfather had left a message folded into the noise, a secret tucked between the static. Night after night, he returned to the radio. Some evenings the voice was faint, buried under hiss and crackle. Other nights it was clearer, like a gentle breeze carrying syllables almost within reach. He never told anyone. Not his parents, not the neighbors, not even the girl who sometimes sat with him under the leaning tree in the yard. The voice was his alone, a hidden thread that tethered him to something vast and unseen. And slowly, the boy began to change. When classmates mocked him for being quiet, for being strange, he simply smiled softly and let the words pass over him like wind. He had the radio, after all. He had a voice no one else heard, a secret star hidden in static. Sometimes, when the world felt sharp and heavy, he would close his eyes and remember the hum of that sound, and it would soften him again, like rain. On dust. The first time the voice called his name, he nearly cried. It was a crooked pronunciation, stretched out and broken by static. But it was there, his name, spoken gently, like a stone dropped into water. He sat frozen, breath shallow, every hair on his skin awake. He whispered back into the silence, but of course the radio carried only one side of the conversation. Still, he believed, no, he knew, that whoever spoke had heard him, somewhere beyond the wires and frequencies, somewhere past the veil of sleep and air. He began to dream differently. Dreams, where the sky opened into rivers of light, where bottles floated with tiny galaxies inside, where laughter carried without mouths to speak it. Dreams where he wasn't just a boy in a tilting house, but something both smaller and larger, like a single star in a wide sky, or a single sky folded into a star. Sometimes, the dreams frightened him with their immensity, but mostly they comforted. They reminded him that even in loneliness, he was part of something, That the voice, even if no one else believed in it, was enough. One night, the radio went quiet. No hiss, no rush of static, no broken whisper, just silence. The boy shook it, tapped its side, turned the dials until they spun like circles of useless time. Nothing. The room felt suddenly heavier, as though the ceiling had dropped closer. He lay in bed wide awake, listening to the stillness that pressed in like an ocean. He thought of his grandfather, of the soft hands that once placed the radio on the shelf, and he wondered if the voice had finally left forever. But in the stillness, something shifted. Not in the radio this time, but in him. A warmth bloomed. Low in his chest, a recognition. The voice was not gone, it was simply moving. It had always been less about the sound and more about the listening. About the space he'd made in himself by believing, by opening, by waiting. He closed his eyes and let the silence wash over him, and in that silence he heard something new. Not words, not static, but a rhythm. His own breathing, steady. His own heartbeat, patient. And beneath it, faint and far away as if carried in the folds of memory, the voice returned. Not in the radio, not even in the room, but in him. And though he couldn't explain it, he understood. The voice had been teaching him all along, not about secrets of stars, not about faraway places, but about how to listen, truly listen, to static, to silence, to others, to himself. He curled into his blanket, a small smile resting on his lips, and drifted into sleep. And in that sleep, the stars gathered close, whispering not in words, but in presence. A boy, a voice, a broken radio, and the beginning of a story that would stretch, slowly, softly, through a lifetime. The night outside pressed against the glass, gentle and endless. The boy dreamt of bottles filled with galaxies, of voices hidden in quiet things, of a world that bent but did not break. And somewhere, in a place neither here nor there, a voice hummed back to him, carrying the first notes of a lullaby. Some houses stand firm, square against the wind, as though declaring their permanence to the world. But his childhood home was not one of those. It leaned, not dramatically, not dangerously, but enough that a visitor might pause at the doorway, tilting their head, wondering if the walls were tired or simply listening. The boy grew up in that tilted house, a place where corners never quite met and floors sloped gently downward, as if guiding you somewhere unseen. To him, it was not strange, it was simply home. The walls creaked like old knees, the windows hummed when storms passed, and at night the rafters whispered to one another like aging friends. The house was alive in its own way. Not with magic, not with secrets, but with patience. It never rushed, never demanded. It simply leaned with the years as grass leans with the wind, and in that leaning the boy learned something no straight, perfect house could have taught him. That strength was not always in rigidity, but in softness. When the wind pressed hard from the east, the house groaned, but it did not fall. When storms rattled the shutters, the house sighed, but it did not break. It yielded, it bent, it swayed just enough to survive. And the boy, watching, listening, began to carry that same softness within himself. He noticed how his mother sometimes paused in the doorway, sighing as though the slant of the kitchen floor added weight to her steps. He noticed how neighbors laughed gently about the crooked roof, whispering that one day it might simply slide away. But to him, the tilt was comforting. It meant the house was alive, that it breathed and shifted just as people did. When he lay in bed at night, he could feel the subtle angle beneath his mattress, and it was like being cradled in a great hand, rocking him into sleep. Friends from school rarely came over. They preferred straight-lined homes with steady staircases and clean walls. He didn't mind. The leaning house felt like his secret companion, the kind that didn't need to be explained. Sometimes he would press his palm against the slanted wall of his bedroom, close his eyes, and imagine that the house pressed back, listening quietly to his unspoken thoughts. One autumn evening, when the wind was restless and the trees outside tossed their branches like dancers, he sat by the window and watched the whole frame of the house tremble. His mother muttered anxiously about repairs, about beams and nails and the stubborn way the house seemed determined to keep leaning. but the boy only smiled, resting his cheek against the cool glass. "It's just bowing," he whispered. Though no one heard him, just bowing to the wind. And in that whisper he felt the first flicker of understanding, the idea that yielding could be a kind of strength, that to bend was not always to break. Years later, when neighbors asked how he stayed so calm when teased, or how he remained gentle in moments others would snap, he never spoke of the house. He simply remembered the way it tilted and sighed, how it carried its imperfections like quiet wisdom, how it leaned yet remained. The boy began to see the world differently. He noticed how trees swayed with storms and survived, while brittle branches snapped. He noticed how rivers curved instead of cutting straight, and how in that winding they found their way to the sea. He noticed how laughter could soften a heavy day, how silence could cradle grief without fixing it. One night, when the moon hung low and silver over the crooked roof, he lay, awake, listening to the house breathe. The walls shifted with the cool air, the beams stretched like tired limbs. And he thought, perhaps the house was teaching him, not through words, but through being, through its tilt, its quiet surrender. To time. In dreams that followed, he often found himself walking through endless halls that leaned and swayed like grass. Some doors were crooked, some floors slanted, but he never stumbled. Instead, he felt guided, every tilt a lesson, every bend a kindness. He would wake in the morning with the echo of those halls still inside him, a memory of balance in imbalance. There was one moment he never forgot. A summer storm, wild and heavy, with rain that slapped the roof like angry hands. Thunder shook the air and his mother gathered candles, her worry sharp as lightning. The boy, small and quiet, sat in the corner of his tilted room and listened. The house creaked, groaned, leaned deeper with each gust. And yet it held. In that holding, the boy felt a strange courage rise in him. Not the kind that shouted or fought, but the kind that waited, breathed, endured. The kind that said, "You can bend, you can sway, you can still be whole." Years later, when he would remember his childhood, it was never the straightness of things that stayed with him, not the tidy roads, not the neat houses, not the lessons written in chalk. It was the leaning house, the way it taught him without a single word, the way it showed him that patience could be as sturdy as stone. He never thought of it as broken. He thought of it as alive, alive in the way grass bows but rises again, alive in the way clouds drift without destination, alive in the way people learn to carry what time places upon them. And so, in a tilted room where dreams leaned into stars, a boy began to learn the first quiet truth of his life, that to live was to sway, to lean, to balance not against time, but with it. The night folded gently around the house, the slanted walls humming their tired, patient song. The boy closed his eyes, smiling softly as the floor seemed to cradle him once more. And though the world outside moved ever onward, inside that tilted home, he felt steady. He felt safe. He felt at peace. He did not discover it in a moment of drama, nor in front of a crowd. It came quietly, as most truths in his life would, like a secret whispered by the world when no one else was listening. He was alone in the crooked bedroom of the leaning house, watching dust drift in a stripe of sunlight. The room had its familiar slope, the floor gently falling toward the window, the walls humming faintly with wind. He reached for a toy that had rolled just beyond his grasp. His fingers strained, his shoulder stretched, and then, stranger than breath itself, his arm kept reaching, sliding longer than it should. For a heartbeat he froze, staring at his hand stretched too far across the slanted floor. He felt no pain, only a soft warmth, as if his body had been waiting to reveal this secret. The toy rested in his palm, almost ordinary, yet the moment was anything but. He pulled back quickly and his arm returned, shortening as though nothing had happened. He looked around the empty room as if someone might step in, as if the walls themselves might tattle. But no one came, only the tilted house, sighing in its usual way. That night he could hardly sleep. He lay staring at the slanted ceiling, replaying the moment again and again. Had he dreamed it? Was it a trick of light, a slip of the mind? But the next morning, when he dropped a spoon under the bed, he reached again, hesitant, unsure, and his arm slid further than it should, brushing the spoon, pulling it back with ease. He sat in silence for a long while, spoon cradled in his hand. It wasn't a trick. It wasn't a dream. It was him. Yet, even as the truth settled into him, there was no rush of triumph, no cry of joy. Instead, there was a quiet wait. What did one do with such a gift? What did it mean to stretch beyond what was expected? Days passed, and he practiced in secret. Not to boast, not to conquer, but to understand. He found that his body bent not only in length but in gentleness, fingers curving around delicate things, arms stretching softly like threads of silk. He could reach the highest shelf without a stool, pick apples from trees without climbing, rescue a kitten trapped in the gutter without a ladder. And yet, more than the usefulness, it was the feeling that stayed with him. The sense of being fluid, unbound by the hardness of bone, softened into something more like a river than a pillar. He never told his mother. Not because he feared her, but because the gift felt too fragile to explain. Like a dream, it might vanish if spoken aloud. So he carried it in silence, letting it bloom in small ways when no one else was looking. Sometimes, in the quiet of the tilted home, he would stretch his hand across the room just to touch the window, feeling the cool glass as though reaching into another world. Other times he would lengthen his arms to encircle himself, folding into his own embrace on lonely nights. He found comfort in this, his body wrapping around his heart, like the leaning house cradling him. It was not a power, made for spectacle. It was not sharp or dazzling. It was soft, humble, unassuming. And perhaps that was why it suited him. One evening, he wandered into the yard as twilight deepened, and he saw a bird struggling in the branches of the leaning tree by the fence. Its wing was caught in a tangle of twigs too high to reach. He paused, looked around, and felt the wind pressing against him as if urging him on. With a deep breath he stretched. His arms slid upward, longer and longer, fingers weaving through branches until they brushed the frightened bird. He spoke softly, murmuring calm, and with careful patience he freed it. The bird fluttered once, twice, then soared into the purple sky, leaving him standing in the grass, his arm retreating slowly back to its natural shape. He smiled, not wide, but quietly, a smile like a lantern flickering in a window. That was the moment he understood. This gift was not about him. It was about others. It was about reaching where others could not, bending where the world was too rigid, offering gentleness where harshness might wound. The house seemed to know, creaking softly as though nodding in agreement. The wind rustled through the crooked eaves like applause too shy to be loud, and in his heart he felt something settle like a seed rooting itself in soft soil. He never tried to show off. In fact, he used his gift so sparingly that most would never have guessed it existed. But each time he stretched, he carried with him the same thought, that kindness could be flexible, that empathy could bend. That sometimes to help another, you had to reach a little further than was comfortable. And so, in the leaning home where floors sloped and walls swayed, a boy discovered the first stretch of self. Not a stretch for power, not a stretch for glory, but a stretch for kindness. When he lay in bed that night, listening to the tilted house breathe, he whispered into the quiet, "Thank you." He wasn't sure if he spoke to the house, to the stars, or to the secret within him. Perhaps all three. And sleep came easily then, his dreams filled with long, winding paths, arms reaching through clouds, rivers bending with his breath. A world of yielding, of soft power, of stretching not to break but to hold. It began with a loaf of bread, not an ordinary loaf, not the kind you slice and serve quickly. This one seemed endless, warm and soft, smelling faintly of sunrise and home. The boy, now a little older, found it on the kitchen table one morning, wrapped in a napkin that was slightly too large, as if the bread had grown faster than the cloth could cover. His mother was nowhere in sight. The oven was cold, and yet the loaf remained warm, steady in its presence. He touched it lightly, and a strange comfort spread through his fingers into his chest. It was as if the bread itself carried patience, a slow rhythm meant to teach him. Something he could not yet name. He took a small piece, just a tiny nibble, and found it tasted richer than any bread he had known. It had honey in it, or perhaps sunlight, or maybe it was simply flavored with care. When he returned a few minutes later, the loaf was just as full as before. Curiosity bloomed, gentle and soft. He tore a larger piece, enough to share, and carried it outside to the yard. The neighbors were few, quiet people who rarely saw him beyond the slanted windows of the leaning house. He knocked gently on the first door and offered a slice. They blinked at him, then smiled, tasting something extraordinary. Without knowing why. When he returned home, the loaf was still whole. The boy began to understand. This bread was not a loaf, it was a lesson. Every piece he gave away returned, replenished, as if the world itself were reminding him that generosity was never finite. That giving, when done with a soft heart, never diminished. He walked the neighborhood, offering slices to those who needed warmth more than food. To a woman who sat alone on her porch, to a tired father whose hands were stained with labor, to children who stared shyly from garden gates. Each time the bread returned, as though it understood the balance between giving and receiving, between care and abundance. And something else began to shift inside him. He realized that generosity was not about grand gestures. It was about noticing where the need was, about reaching, offering, and stepping back without expectation. The endless loaf had taught him this before he could even speak the lesson aloud. One evening, he shared the bread with a small group of children in the yard. They laughed softly, passing crumbs from one hand to another, marveling at the warmth that seemed to spread farther than the pieces themselves. He watched them, silent, and felt a gentle pride bloom, not for himself but for the connection, the invisible thread that tied them all together in that moment. The sun dipped low, painting the tilted house in amber light, and still the loaf remained. He tore a piece for himself, and it tasted like the calm before a storm, the hush of twilight, the gentle weight of a world holding steady. He realized that the bread, like his stretching gift, was not meant to be powerful in spectacle. It was quiet, patient, persistent. It nurtured slowly, softly, leaving a trace of warmth in every heart it touched. Sometimes calmer, the boy thought about the voice in the radio, still alive in memory, though quiet now. Perhaps the loaf, like the voice, was another way the universe whispered, teaching him through simple things. That small acts, sharing bread, listening quietly, bending to reach, could echo far beyond what one could see. He began to carry the lesson with him everywhere. When a neighbor's cat climbed too high in a tree, he remembered the gentle patience of giving. When the wind knocked a branch onto a path, he remembered the soft persistence of the loaf. When friends argued and harsh words flew, he remembered that generosity was not just about food. It was about care, about extending a hand without judgment, about softening the edges of a hard day. By the time he returned home each evening, the loaf was always waiting. He would slice a piece, hold it in his hands, and feel the quiet rhythm of replenishment. It became a lullaby of sorts, a reminder that kindness and care were endless when approached with patience, that the world, despite its angles and slants, held enough for all who noticed the small spaces where love could fit. One night, as he sat under the leaning tree with crumbs scattered around him, he whispered to the stars, "Thank you for this gift. Thank you for showing me how giving can stretch beyond itself." And though the stars remained silent, he felt their quiet agreement, their light bending gently toward him. And in that simple act, the boy learned a truth he would carry forever. Generosity, like his stretching arms, is strongest not when it is loud or forceful, but when it is soft, patient, persistent, and quietly boundless. The loaf, like the voice, like the house, like the gifts inside him, had become more than itself. It had become a teacher, a companion, a quiet, endless reminder that in giving, in reaching beyond one's own need, the heart grows wider, softer, and infinitely stronger. He leaned back against the crooked wall of the house, crumbs in his lap, the sun fading behind the horizon. The day had been ordinary and yet extraordinary, Bread, like kindness, had stretched across his neighborhood, leaving warmth in its quiet wake. And as night settled in, he felt the soft rhythm of sleep approach, not hurried, not urgent, but patient, like the loaf itself, like all the lessons of small, lasting generosity. He closed his eyes under the tilting roof, the smell of bread lingering in the air, and felt a calmness settle over him. The world outside hummed with possibility, quiet and gentle. And somewhere in the folds of memory and time, he knew that giving, truly giving, could carry further than he had ever imagined. Dreams had always been quiet companions for the boy. Sometimes they arrived in the night like a soft sigh, drifting in through the leaning windows of his crooked house. Sometimes they were tangled and strange, like clouds caught in the wrong season, or shadows that lingered longer than they should. But this night, the dream was different. It began as a whisper, faint and melodic, like a song someone had forgotten but still remembered how to hum. He was walking along a river that was not quite water, not quite light. The surface shimmered with colors he had never seen, deep purples, soft greens, golds that seemed to hum when touched. And in that shimmer, he heard a voice that was not his own. "You can speak with dreams," it said, not loudly, not sharply, but with a warmth that made the words curl gently around him. The boy paused. "I don't understand," he whispered, though he knew he had to listen, and listening was something he had already learned from the radio, the leaning house and the endless loaf of bread. "Dreams have a language," the voice said, "a language of feeling, of gesture, of quiet, understanding. You do not need words. You need only attention, patience, and presence." The voice was kind, patient, without judgment. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, like wind brushing through trees or sunlight pooling on the slanted floor of his bedroom. The boy wanted to ask 100 questions, but he remembered what the voice had taught him. Sometimes listening is more important than speaking. A figure emerged from the riverlight, a mentor of sorts, draped in a cloak that shimmered, like the surface beneath their feet. They did not walk, nor did they float. They simply were, as if existence itself had taken form in gentle curves and shifting colors. "Come," said the mentor softly, extending a hand that seemed to reach beyond itself, much like the boy's own stretching gift. "The dreams are speaking. Will you listen?" The boy nodded, unsure how to answer, but feeling deep inside that he had always known how to do just that. He stepped forward. The river responded. Colors moved, shifted, pulsed, shapes of forgotten memories and half-formed. Wishes drifted past him. He reached out with his mind, with his heart, letting himself absorb the currents. And then he felt it. Each dream carried emotion, a story, a rhythm. Each one spoke in ways that could not be captured by words alone. Sadness was a low hum, joy, a bright ripple, longing a gentle stretch like a bowing tree. "You see," said the mentor, voice weaving through the currents, "dreams are not puzzles to solve. They are conversations. They speak to you as much as you speak to them. And when you listen, when you truly understand, the world bends with you, quietly, gently, in ways you will carry into waking life." The key. Boy closed his eyes in the dream and felt the river wrap around him, carrying him forward not with force but with guidance. He realized then that this was not just a dream. It was a mirror of everything he had begun to understand. The stretching, the leaning house, the endless loaf of bread. Life itself was a conversation. To bend without breaking, to give without expecting, to listen without rushing. This was the language of existence. For hours, or perhaps only minutes, because time was strange here, he practiced. He reached out with thought, with feeling, with his heart. He responded to dreams, not with words, but with quiet attention. Each ripple he sent back caused the river to shimmer brighter. Each gesture, small and careful, created warmth in the drifting forms. He felt his empathy growing, stretching, not unlike his body in moments of care and rescue. When the mentor finally spoke again, the boy felt a twinge of reluctance. "You have learned well," they said. "But remember, dreams will always speak. Sometimes clearly, sometimes softly, sometimes in the smallest shifts, and the lessons you learn here will follow you into waking, if you choose to carry them. He woke before he could answer, the morning light spilling through the slanted windows of the leaning house. The radio sat quietly on the shelf, silent, waiting. The bread from yesterday still lay wrapped on the table, warm as ever, but something had shifted inside him. He felt the quiet authority of dreams lingering in his chest, a pulse of understanding that did not fade with the rising sun. In the days that followed, he noticed things he hadn't before. When a neighbor cried softly behind a closed door, he felt their sorrow in a way that went beyond words. When the wind pressed through the leaning roof, he recognized its whispers as stories. When the smallest act of kindness occurred, he felt the echo as though it were part of the river from his dream, winding and persistent. He began keeping a small journal, not for others, not for proof, but for memory. He sketched the shapes of his dreams, the colors, the bends and folds. He noted feelings, patterns, moments of clarity, and though he never fully understood the dreams, he did not need to. He had learned their language in the softest way, through listening, through attention, through quiet patience. Sometimes at night, he would lie awake and hear fragments of dreams mingling with the hum of the leaning house and the warmth of bread that never ended. And in those nights he realized that the world was always speaking. The universe had always been a conversation, waiting for someone patient enough, someone gentle enough to hear it. And the boy, quiet and bending, stretching and yielding, listened. He listened until sleep returned, carrying him into another night where the river shimmered. The mentor watched with patience, and dreams spoke softly, insistently, but never urgently. And he knew that these whispers would follow him, in waking and in sleeping, shaping the ways he gave, reached, and stretched toward others in ways the world often overlooked. The lesson was gentle, but profound. To understand another, to touch the currents of their heart, to hear what is unspoken, that is the gift, the responsibility, and the quiet power of listening. And as dawn lit the leaning walls of the house, the boy felt it settle, like sunlight on his shoulders. He was ready for the small acts of care and generosity that would define him, ready to bend without breaking, to reach without expectation, to carry the quiet wisdom of dreams into each waking moment. In the soft folds of the morning, he whispered almost to himself, "I will listen, I will remember, I will bend." And somewhere, deep in the river of dreams, the mentor smiled. Friendship, he learned slowly, did not always arrive with words. Sometimes it arrived as a presence, quiet, steady, almost imperceptible, and yet profoundly grounding. He met her on a spring morning, under the leaning tree that had become his favorite place to think. She was sitting on the grass, knees drawn close, eyes tracing the swaying branches, as if reading the rhythm of the wind. She didn't speak at first, didn't smile, didn't call out, but when he approached, she simply lifted her gaze and nodded softly, acknowledging him without words. He found that he liked this. The silence was not empty. It was full of listening, full of waiting, full of understanding in a way that rushed speech often was not. He introduced himself anyway. I'm just me," he said. She tilted her head slightly, a small smile forming, though still she spoke no words. That was enough. Her presence answered what speech could not. Days passed, and they met again under the tree. Sometimes they brought books, sometimes toys, sometimes nothing at all. They simply existed, together side by side, observing clouds, watching leaves drift, feeling the tilt of the earth beneath them. And gradually he realized she was listening in a way that mattered. She was present. She noticed the small things, the twitch of a tail, the glint of sunlight on a slanted window, the gentle bend of his outstretched hand, reaching for something, just beyond reach. He began to speak more freely around her, sharing thoughts he had never told anyone else, the voice in the radio, the endless loaf of bread, the dreams that spoke back. She did not interrupt, did not comment, did not judge. She simply nodded or blinked, sometimes reaching out a hand that lingered near his without touching. And in that silent acknowledgement, he felt heard, truly and fully, for the first time. Outside the tilted walls of his home. One afternoon, they found a small hidden creek behind the yard, its waters calm and clear. They followed it for hours, stepping over smooth stones, listening to the soft rush of water. He noticed that whenever he paused, she paused. Whenever he whispered a thought, she seemed to understand without replying. He realized that this was the language of their friendship, not in spoken words, but in the quiet synchronization of attention and care. It was during these moments that he understood something crucial. Not all bonds are loud or urgent. Some bonds are subtle, almost invisible, yet they carry weight far deeper than any shout or command. They exist in the spaces between words, in shared glances, in the calm steadiness of being present for one another. The seasons shifted. Leaves turned gold and fell. Snow brushed the crooked rooftops of his home, and still she was there. The friendship did not demand anything, did not falter with time. It simply existed, like the leaning house, like the endless loaf, like the lessons of bending and listening he had learned in silence. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the slanted windows amber, he found himself sharing a secret fear, something he had never admitted to anyone, that the world outside, with its sharp edges and rushing voices, sometimes overwhelmed him. She didn't speak, didn't offer advice. She just sat close, her presence steady, almost a shield, and in that shield he felt calm. He realized then that silence, when given with care, could be more powerful than words. They discovered small rituals that no one else would understand, the way they would trace patterns in the sand by the creek, the way they would leave tiny offerings for ants or birds, the way they counted the stars together at night without saying a single number aloud. Each act was quiet, yet each deepened their bond, teaching him that connection did not need to be loud or obvious to be real. Sometimes calmer people asked him if she was his sister, or a cousin, or someone special in another way. He would smile softly and shake his head. No, she was simply there, and that was enough. It had always been enough. On a day when the wind shook the leaning house harder than usual, he realized something else. In her silence, he had learned patience. He had learned to observe before acting, to listen before responding, to give presence more weight than words. And in that patience, he discovered a new layer of his own stretching, his empathy, his ability to reach out gently, to bend without breaking. The creek, the leaning tree, the quiet hours under shifting skies, they became a shared world. And in that world, he understood the rhythm of friendship. It was a stretch, not of the body, but of the heart. It required openness, trust, and the willingness to be seen without explanation. One night, as he lay in bed under the slanted roof, he thought of her. She was in his dreams too, walking beside him, silent, steady, a presence that carried understanding and warmth. He realized that some friendships are like rivers. They flow quietly, bend around obstacles, and reach far beyond where you first noticed them. And though neither of them would say it aloud, he knew something important. She had become a mirror for his heart, a companion who could answer without speaking, who could see without judging, who could listen without interruption. And in that reflection, he learned more about himself than any word could ever convey. He smiled softly, listening to the wind rocking the crooked house, feeling the bread's warmth lingering in memory, the echo of the dreams that spoke back. And he understood, finally, that some of life's most profound lessons come not from what is said, but from what is held in quiet presence, in shared silence, in the gentle rhythm of two hearts bending to meet one another. As sleep approached, he whispered a quiet gratitude into the dark, for the leaning house, for the endless loaf, for the dreams, and for the friend who answered in silence. He realized that these small quiet gifts, the stretching, the giving, the listening, were weaving together the world he was slowly learning to inhabit. Soft, patient, and endlessly kind. And somewhere, under the starry sky, she was listening. The river was quiet at first, a slow, soft current winding through the edge of the village, unnoticed by most. But he noticed it, always had. He liked to sit by its bank, letting the water ripple across stones, watching how it reflected the leaning house, the swaying trees, and occasionally himself. He had discovered something new that spring. Not a power in the dramatic sense like fire or flight, but something subtler. His heart, his emotions, seemed to reach beyond himself. When he felt calm, the water glimmered more gently. When he felt joy, the river's surface sparkled like silver dust. When he carried sorrow, small eddies twisted in silent conversation with the currents. It was a revelation that came slowly, quietly, the way most of his lessons had. One morning he sat with the loaf crumbs scattered near the bank, the leaning tree stretching overhead, and felt a profound stillness inside him. And then he noticed the river, its gentle rise and fall, the way tiny waves brushed the shore, and realized it was listening. At first, he tried small things. He thought a happy thought, imagining the sun warming the tilted house, imagining laughter in the yard. He watched as the river shimmered, as if agreeing, as if responding. He smiled. The river was not alive in the usual sense, yet it was alive to him. Curiosity grew. He experimented in quiet moments, thinking calm thoughts when the water grew restless, letting kindness fill him when others felt angry or sad. And he discovered a subtle truth. When his heart opened, when he allowed care to flow freely, the river responded. It bent to his rhythm, reflecting not only what he felt but also shaping the environment around him in delicate, meaningful ways. It wasn't magic in a flashy sense. There were no explosions of light, no sudden transformations. Just calm, slow, change. Leaves floated more gently down the current. Birds paused to drink in quieter moments. Even the smallest fish seemed to dart with less fear, as if encouraged by the soft energy radiating from him. One afternoon, a child from the village wandered to the riverbank, crying softly. She had lost her favorite toy in the water, and her small voice trembled like a leaf in the wind. Without thinking, he stretched his hand over the water, bending low, and felt the river's subtle pull guiding the toy toward him. The child's eyes widened as he returned it to her, and she whispered a thank you, not knowing that the river itself had helped, nudged along by the boy's gentle heart. He began to understand what this meant. Listening was not passive. It was active in the quietest way. By attending to the world, by caring for it and for others, one could create small ripples that reached farther than words ever could. Emotions were not just private. They were bridges. Sometimes, he would sit for hours, letting the river flow around him, imagining the feelings he wanted to share with the world. Joy, hope, calm, understanding. He imagined the village waking peacefully, neighbors noticing the subtle warmth of a day guided by care. And in those moments he realized that listening, to himself, to others, to rivers and trees, to the slanted walls of his home, was a gift that shaped everything. The mentor's words from the dream river came back to him. You do not need words, you need only attention, patience, and presence. Here by the river he saw it in practice. Every beat of his heart, every ripple of kindness, every quiet gesture of empathy. These were conversations invisible yet profoundly real. The seasons shifted once more. Summer's heat softened into autumn's crisp air, and the river reflected the change in its flow. Leaves drifted lazily, their colors mirrored on the water's surface. He noticed the elders of the village walking by, heads bowed, faces lined with burdens. When he approached quietly, stretching just enough to touch their hands or offer a comforting presence, the river seemed to echo his care, softening the day around them. One evening, as twilight settled in, he realized the deepest lesson. The river did not need his guidance. It had its own course, its own rhythm. What mattered was his willingness to meet it where it was, to bend with it, to let the current become a conversation rather than a battle. The river had always been alive, but his heart's presence amplified what was already there. And in that quiet understanding he felt a surge of connection, to the water, to the village, to the leaning house, to the endless loaf, to the friend who answered in silence, to the dreams that spoke back. Every small act, every careful choice, every heartbeat had a resonance, a ripple, a song in the world. He stayed by the river long into the evening, letting his hand drift over the water, feeling its gentle tug respond to the rhythm of his heart. The stars began to emerge, twinkling faintly, as if acknowledging the lesson of the day. And he realized that true strength was not in holding tightly, but in allowing oneself to bend, to reach, and to listen. Sometimes, he imagined the river carrying whispers from his own heart, far beyond the village. Perhaps a lonely soul somewhere would feel a subtle warmth, a reminder that someone cared even from a distance. Perhaps a child would learn patience, or a weary traveler would sense the quiet persistence of kindness. He did not know, and that was the point. Listening was its own reward. Giving silently was its own fulfillment. At night, he returned home, tired but calm, the leaning house embracing him like a cradle. His body stretched easily, arms rising to meet the soft shadows on the ceiling, and he carried with him the memory of the river's gentle response, the invisible conversation of care, and the quiet knowledge that his presence could shape the world in ways no one would see but everyone would feel. He fell asleep that night, the murmuring of the river echoing in his chest, the stars twinkling in rhythm with his steady heartbeat. And somewhere, in the soft folds of darkness, he understood that empathy was not an action. It was a flow like water, like light, like dreams, like the bend of a body that gives itself without breaking. And so the river listened, and so he listened. And in that listening the world became, ever so gently, a little more kind. There was a night in the village when light seemed to move more slowly than time itself. Lanterns were carried from house to house, their flames contained within delicate paper shells, drifting like quiet wishes across the streets and the river that had learned to listen. He had never seen anything like it before. The air was heavy, with the soft scent of night-blooming flowers, with whispers of wind through leaning trees, and with the gentle hum of people speaking in tones low enough to blend with the lantern's soft glow. He held a small lantern in his hands, feeling the warmth of the candle's light, aware of the subtle pull it had on the world around him. Beside him, his friend, the one who answered in silence, walked slowly, holding her own lantern. She did not speak, but he felt her presence in every step, in every quiet glance toward the floating lights. He realized that they were sharing something extraordinary, something that could not be captured in words, the fleeting beauty of a single, unhurried moment. The boy thought of the leaning house, of the endless loaf of bread, of the river that bent to his heart. He realized that all these lessons, all these gifts, had led him here, to the soft illumination of flickering flames, drifting like memory across the darkened streets. He understood that life, at its best, was like these lanterns, small, radiant, ephemeral yet powerful in the quiet warmth it left behind. They moved along the riverbank, the lanterns casting reflections in the water that shimmered like 1,000 tiny stars. Each light seemed to have a personality of its own, drifting and turning in the gentle breeze, sometimes floating high, sometimes lingering close to the surface, as if conversing with the currents themselves. He noticed how the river responded, gentle waves forming beneath the lanterns, guiding them, reflecting them, bending to accommodate their soft passage. He felt a strange thrill, not the loud excitement of adventure, but a quiet awe that settled deep into his chest. It was the awe of noticing, of being present, of allowing the world to unfold without interference. He reached out with his stretching gift, nudging a lantern that had drifted too close to the river's edge, guiding it back to the flow. The warmth of the flame seemed to echo in his fingertips, connecting him to the moment in a way that words never could. Nearby, other villagers carried their lanterns, some whispering wishes, some simply enjoying the calm. The boy realized that each light, each gesture, each presence was part of a larger rhythm. Life was not about rushing or demanding. Life, he thought, was about participation in these small luminous rituals, about allowing the quiet beauty of existence to be noticed, honored, shared. As the night deepened, the lanterns rose higher, lifted by the wind, floating over the roofs of the tilted houses, across the gardens where flowers leaned into the night, and above the river that had learned to listen. He and his silent friend watched in awe, feeling the rhythm of the lanterns move through them, a gentle heartbeat that connected them to everyone and everything around them. The boy thought of his stretching gift, of the river, of the endless loaf. He realized that these acts of bending, of giving, of listening, had taught him the subtle language of care and presence. Now the lanterns themselves seemed to speak that language, carrying his small efforts, his quiet love, across the world in ways he could not measure but deeply felt. He noticed the fleeting expressions of people around him, the tender glance of a parent to a child, the soft squeeze of hands between friends, the quiet nods exchanged in the shadows. Everything was temporary, and yet everything mattered. The impermanence of the lanterns reminded him of life itself, a slow drifting beauty, meant to be noticed and cherished. At one point, a lantern floated close to his hand, as if seeking his touch. He guided it gently back into the current, smiling at the quiet cooperation between his gesture and its drift. His friend watched him, her eyes reflecting the flames, and he felt a warmth that went deeper than companionship. It was understanding without words, resonance without explanation, a shared heartbeat in the hush of night. He realized that the world, much like the lanterns, was filled with small acts of brilliance waiting to be noticed. Each gesture of care, each soft smile, each quiet presence, these were the lights that drifted slowly through life, connecting people across distances and time. And to participate, to recognize, to hold and guide these lights gently, was a kind of heroism more profound than any celebrated in tales or songs. By the riverbank, he paused and let the lantern in his hand float freely. It drifted up, catching the wind, joining the others. For a moment he felt weightless, as if he too were floating among the stars, among the hopes and whispers of countless hearts. His silent friend mirrored him, releasing her lantern in tandem, and together they watched the flames climb higher, blending with the first hints of dawn on the horizon. The night ended not with a bang or a rush, but with the quiet settling of moments into memory. The lanterns, though now distant, left warmth behind, a lingering glow in the river, the leaning houses, and the hearts of those who had seen them. He understood that these small lights, like his stretching gift, like the endless loaf, like the river's listening, were lessons in gentleness, patience, and care. And as he walked home under the leaning roof of his house, he felt a quiet joy, soft and expansive, that only came from recognizing fleeting beauty, from participating in the rhythm of life, from bending his heart and presence toward the world with intention and love. He whispered to the night, to the stars, to the river, "Thank you for letting me see. Thank you for teaching me to float, slowly, gently, with the rest of the world." And as sleep returned, carrying him into dreams where lanterns drifted among rivers, bread replenished itself endlessly, and friendship spoke without words, he felt the soft exhale of the universe surrounding him, steady, warm, and infinitely patient. He remembered his brother in quiet flashes like sunlight through the slanted windows of the leaning house. Not all memories were loud, not all were shaped by grand events or dramatic departures. Some lingered softly, like the echo of a familiar song in an empty room, or the gentle sway of a tree in the evening wind. His brother had been older, steadier, someone who understood the world in a way that made him feel both safe and small. They had shared mornings by the crooked house, afternoons in the hidden corners of the village, evenings tracing the stars with soft, patient fingers. And then, one day, his brother left. Not with anger, not with noise, but with the subtle quiet of a presence slipping away. The boy was left behind. At first, the absence felt sharp, like a wind cutting through the warmth of the leaning house. He tried to speak to the empty spaces, to call across the garden, to fill the silence with words that would not come. But the house, the river, the trees, and even the drifting lanterns could not replace what had been lost. He learned slowly, in the manner of all things meaningful, that absence could teach as much as presence. In his brother's leaving, he discovered patience, resilience, and the strange beauty of memory. He remembered the way his brother's hand felt in his, the quiet jokes, the soft reprimands, the shared understanding that needed no explanation. Each recollection was a lesson in gentleness, a reminder that love could exist even when someone was not there. Some afternoons, he would sit by the river that had learned to listen, letting his thoughts drift toward his brother. He would stretch, his arms in the air, not to reach him, not to summon him back, but to honor the space he had left behind. Sometimes the river shimmered more brightly, reflecting his heart. Sometimes it rippled gently, acknowledging the quiet ache of longing. It was in these moments that he began to understand another subtle truth. Absence does not diminish love. It shapes it, bends it, makes it pliable and enduring. The love he felt for his brother was not tied to presence or proximity. It existed as a quiet current, flowing through his heart, guiding his gestures, influencing his interactions, reminding him of the bond that could neither be broken nor measured by time alone. The endless loaf, the whispering dreams, the stretching of his body, and the silent companionship of his friend, they all seemed connected to this lesson. His brother's absence had taught him to give without expectation, to hold without clinging, to bend without breaking. And as he carried these lessons into the world, he realized that resilience was not a fortress of steel, but a soft, yielding presence that could stretch to accommodate both joy and sorrow. One evening, he returned home to find the leaning house bathed in amber light. Shadows played across the floor, echoing the shape of memories he had long tucked away. He thought of his brother sitting beside him, of shared afternoons filled with laughter and quiet observation. Though the room was empty, he felt a trace of that presence lingering, soft and unobtrusive, like a hand resting lightly on his shoulder. He smiled quietly, a gesture that required no sound. "I see you," he whispered into the empty space, not for anyone else but for himself. It was enough to acknowledge the bond, enough to carry its warmth into the next day, into the next act of kindness, into the stretching of his hands to help another or the listening to the river's quiet song. Sometimes, he imagined his brother watching over the village from afar, a silent guardian whose lessons had shaped him more than words ever could. And in that imagining he felt comfort, not sorrow, a sense that love once given remains even in absence. The boy learned to fold these lessons into daily life. When neighbors struggled, he extended hands and warmth, guided not by expectation of gratitude, but by the memory of the care his brother had shown. When the wind pressed against the leaning house, he held doors gently, mindful of the echoes of presence and absence. When small joys occurred, children laughing, lanterns floating, bread being shared, he allowed himself to feel them fully, carrying both the joy and the quiet remembrance of the one who had left. He came to understand that resilience was not something to announce. It was something to embody quietly, a soft current running beneath every interaction. He stretched his heart, bending it to hold both happiness and longing, giving space for the absence without letting it harden him. He had learned that love could survive distance and time, that the lessons of someone gone could be as present as any living teacher. On nights when the stars were clear, he would walk outside, feeling the tilt of the leaning house beneath him, the soft hum of the village around him, and imagine his brother among the constellations. Perhaps he was watching the river, perhaps he was smiling at the drifting lanterns, perhaps he was listening in the quiet places that connected them all. And in that imagining, he found peace. He felt the pull of absence, not as a void, but as a quiet shaping force, guiding him toward empathy, patience, and the subtle acts of kindness that defined him more than any loud accomplishment could. He realized at last that love was not possession. It was presence even when unseen. It was care even when unanswered. It was bending, yielding, stretching without expectation, and giving quietly, without measure. And through this realization, he grew more tender, more resilient, more capable of reaching out to the world in ways both subtle and profound. As he settled into the tilting house that night, listening to the soft creaks and sighs of walls that had held so many secrets, he whispered a soft gratitude for the brother who stayed behind, for the lessons of absence, for the quiet shaping of his heart. And somewhere, he felt, his brother's memory folded gently into the rhythm of life around him, guiding him as surely as any teacher, any mentor, any companion ever could. He closed his eyes, the leaning house cradling him, the river humming quietly in his imagination, and felt the soft exhale of understanding settle over him. Love, absence, resilience, these were threads he would carry through every stretching hand, every shared loaf, every quiet gesture of empathy. And in that carrying, he felt the steady pulse of life itself, soft and unhurried, like the drifting lanterns that had begun to teach him the beauty of fleeting, patient light. The mentor appeared one quiet evening, not in the swirl of dreams this time, but in the gentle dimness of the leaning house's living room. The boy, now slowly growing into adolescence, had felt their presence before, a soft pull at the edges of thought, like wind brushing across a window pane. But tonight, the air seemed fuller, heavier, with something both tender and final. The mentor did not speak at first. They simply sat in the worn chair near the fireplace, the flames flickering and throwing soft shadows across their features. The boy sensed that tonight there would be no lessons shouted, no sudden revelations. Just the quiet offering of presence, steady, unwavering, and full of care. "You've grown," the mentor whispered finally, their voice a thread of warmth threading through the room. "More than I could have hoped. You've learned to stretch, not just your body but your heart. You've listened, given, and held without expectation." The boy nodded, feeling the weight of their words, feeling gratitude and an ache that was neither sharp nor sudden. He had learned from the radios, whispers from the endless loaf, from the silent companionship of a friend, and from the river that bent to his care. But this moment, the quiet acknowledgement from a teacher who had guided his dreams, was its own kind of sacred dot. The mentor reached out, placing a hand lightly on his shoulder. The touch was not urgent, not commanding. It simply rested there, offering reassurance. "There will come a time," they said, "when you will not see me again, but know this, all I have given, all I have shared, is now part of you. My absence will not be empty. It will be a lullaby, a whisper carried in your heart." He tried to speak, but words felt small, inadequate. So he listened. He felt the warmth, the calm, the subtle exhale of presence that seemed to fold around him like a blanket. The mentor's breath became a rhythm he could follow, a soft reminder that lessons, when given with care, endure beyond sight or sound. They spent the evening walking slowly through the small garden behind the leaning house. The stars were just beginning to emerge, delicate pinpricks in a deepening sky. The mentor showed him flowers whose names he had forgotten, stones shaped like smooth memories, and paths that twisted unpredictably, each turn teaching patience, attention, and respect for what was fragile and fleeting. "You see," the mentor said, voice as soft as the wind in the leaning tree, "the world teaches through small acts, a flower opening, a stone worn smooth by water, a loaf of bread that never ends. You've learned to notice these things, to bend with them, to care. This is the quiet power of life." The boy felt it deeply. The lessons were everywhere, not in loud victories, not in dramatic battles, but in small, deliberate attentions. His stretching, his giving, his listening, all these acts were threads weaving him into the tapestry of the world. And the mentor, seeing him now, recognized that the weaving was nearly complete. At last, they returned to the living room where the fire had softened to glowing embers. The mentor paused, looking at him with eyes that held all the warmth and all the melancholy of the world itself. "When I am gone," they whispered, "do not grieve as though something is lost. Instead, remember as you would remember a favorite song, a river's gentle hum, the warmth of bread shared on a quiet afternoon. Carry the lessons forward, and they will guide you as I cannot." The boy felt tears gather, but not of sorrow. They were the quiet release of understanding, of love acknowledged, of presence honored. He nodded, pressing a hand to his chest, feeling the rhythm of the moment settle deep into him. "I will," he whispered finally. "I will carry it." The mentor's hand lingered a moment longer, then withdrew, leaving a warmth that remained even in absence. He watched as they rose and stepped into the leaning shadows, their silhouette blending with the shapes of the house and the garden. He sensed that they would not return in the same way, but that their presence had become part of him, like the river, like the endless loaf, like the quiet friend who answered in silence. Night deepened, and the boy sat by the window watching the stars. He thought of the mentor's words, repeating them softly to himself, as if turning them into a lullaby. Not lost but carried, not gone but whispered, not ended but remembered. In the days that followed, he noticed subtle changes in himself. He reached for the small kindnesses that mattered most, extending hands to neighbors, sharing bread, listening to the river, tending to the quiet needs of the village. He found that even when the mentor was absent, their lessons guided every stretch of his heart, every bend in his attention, every act of empathy. Sometimes, he returned to the garden, tracing the paths they had walked together, pausing to see flowers, stones, and shadows with the same care they had shown him. And though he walked alone, he felt the presence of the mentor, folded into the rhythm of the world, teaching him still. He began to understand the deepest lesson of all. Loss, when given with care, does not wound. It transforms. Absence, handled like a lullaby, can teach patience, quiet strength, and the profound joy of presence remembered. He carried the whispers of the mentor in his chest, a soft, steady guide for every day that followed. One evening, as the river reflected the first stars, he realized he had internalized the lesson completely. He could give without expectation, listen without needing a reply, bend without breaking, and notice the subtle rhythms of life without the mentor by his side. They had given him everything he needed, the understanding that presence matters more than action, that listening can heal, and that love can endure even when the one who teaches it is gone. And as he lay in bed that night, under the leaning roof of the house that had always bent with time, he whispered a quiet thanks to the mentor, to the river, to the lanterns, to the endless loaf, and to every soft, unspoken lesson that had shaped him. He understood that their departure was not an ending, but a lullaby, a gentle whisper folded into the world, a reminder that lessons given with love linger forever. He drifted into sleep, carrying the mentor's last whisper with him, a soft, persistent presence in the currents of his heart. And somewhere in the quiet folds of memory and dream, he felt the gentle acknowledgement of a teacher's love, ever present, ever patient, and endlessly kind. The town was never quite awake, nor entirely asleep. It moved in a rhythm that existed somewhere between dusk and dawn, where shadows stretched longer than light, and whispers lingered in corners like forgotten songs. The boy, now older, more aware of the world's subtleties, discovered it by accident, walking along the crooked streets after following a particularly curious ripple in the river that seemed to call his name. At first, he thought the people were asleep. They wandered slowly, eyes unfocused, hands moving in gentle, repetitive motions. Some carried lanterns like he had once, flickering small flames that bent the shadows in unusual ways. Others hummed softly, tunes he couldn't quite catch, melodies that felt like they belonged to no one and everyone at once. He realized quickly that these were not ordinary sleepers. They were the town of sleepwalkers, caught between waking and dreaming, walking through the world with one foot in the present and one foot in the soft fold of a dream. There was no chaos here, no danger, only a strange, serene rhythm that enveloped everything in calm. Curious, he stepped carefully among them. His stretching gift, once a novelty, now a gentle part of his being, allowed him to move fluidly through the slow motions of the town without disturbing the fragile balance. He reached out to a woman carrying a small tray of glowing stones, guiding it back to her when it teetered on the edge of the path. She didn't notice, or perhaps she did in a way he could not comprehend, but he felt a soft acknowledgement in the sway of her movements. He walked farther, observing. The town seemed alive in a different sense than his own village. Here stillness was action, silence was communication, presence was a bridge. And he understood that the sleepwalkers were teaching him something new. Life did not always require awareness to matter. Even in a half-dream, in a gentle sway between here and there, goodness could exist, small but persistent. A boy about his own age drifted past, carrying a bundle of flowers in one hand, tracing patterns in the cobblestones with the other. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and the older boy, no longer just a child, yet not fully grown, smiled softly. There was recognition there, an understanding that could not be spoken, that did not need language. And in that moment he realized, empathy can bridge even the quietest gaps. even between two souls moving slowly, suspended between waking and dreaming. He followed the river through the town, watching how it curled and twisted around the sleepwalkers' feet, its currents bending to their movements, as it had always bent to his own presence. The rhythm of water, people, and light seemed inseparable here, an unbroken cycle of gentle motion. He thought of the endless loaf of bread, replenished quietly for neighbors, and of his friend who answered without speaking. Both were part of a language the town now used instinctively, a soft, patient understanding that flowed through small gestures, careful steps, and the quiet attention to what mattered. Sometimes he reached out, stretching a hand to steady a sleepwalker on uneven stones or nudging a lantern so it did not topple into the shallow river. Each motion was small, imperceptible perhaps to those who did not look closely, but deeply significant to him. He realized that influence did not always announce itself. The touch, the nudge, the bending without breaking. These were acts of quiet heroism, subtle ripples shaping the world without need for recognition. Night deepened, and lanterns floated higher, carried by the soft drafts that curled through the tilted roofs and cobblestone streets. He noticed the delicate hum of voices, soft, rhythmic, almost like a lullaby, blending with the river's whispering. It reminded him of the mentor, of the endless loaf, of the friend who answered in silence. All these threads of learning and care seemed to converge here in this town, caught between two states of being. He paused near a small bridge, watching a group of sleepwalkers release paper lanterns into the river. The flames reflected softly on the water, blending with the stars that began to appear overhead. Each light seemed to carry a wish, a memory, a quiet hope. He stretched his hand just enough to touch one as it floated past, feeling the gentle warmth ripple through him. And in that warmth, he sensed the truth of the town. Life's beauty is often found in subtle, fleeting moments, in the quiet intersections of presence and attention, in gestures no louder than a heartbeat. He noticed a small girl trailing behind. Her parents, her steps unsure, her eyes wide. She carried a single flower, its petals trembling in the soft night air. The boy knelt, gently guiding her hand to the river so the flower could touch the water without tipping over. She looked at him, blinked once, and smiled. That simple gesture, the passing of care without expectation, felt like the culmination of everything he had been learning, stretching, listening, bending, giving, and allowing the world to respond in its own time. Hours passed, though he could not say how many. Time itself seemed different in the town of sleepwalkers, stretched and softened like the leaning house or the river. And when the first light of dawn began to brush the rooftops, he noticed that the town slowly dissolved into ordinary rhythms. People awoke in their homes, streets emptied, and the river flowed as it always had. Yet he carried with him the quiet, pulse of the night, the lessons hidden in stillness, and the understanding that the softest, most patient influences often leave the deepest impressions. He returned home as the sun rose, tilting his head toward the leaning roof of his house, listening to the familiar creaks and sighs. The world seemed both the same and subtly changed. He felt the resonance of the night, the sleepwalker's patience, the river's quiet response, the lantern's slow drift, folding into his own rhythm, teaching him once again that presence. Listening and gentle care were as profound as any grand act of courage. As he lay down that morning, the memory of the sleepwalkers lingered in the quiet folds of his mind. He understood that life often exists between moments, between words, between waking and dreaming, and those in-between spaces, he realized, are where empathy, patience, and quiet understanding grow. And somewhere, in that delicate, half-asleep world, the boy smiled softly, stretching just a little, letting his heart bend toward the rhythm of the town, the river, the lanterns, and all the quiet, persistent lessons that life had been teaching him. He returned home as the sun rose, tilting, his head toward the leaning roof of his house, listening to the familiar creaks and sighs. The world seemed both the same and subtly changed. He felt the resonance of the night, the sleepwalker's patience, the river's quiet response, the lantern's slow drift, folding into his own rhythm, teaching him once again that presence. Listening and gentle care were as profound as any grand act of courage. As he lay down that morning, the memory of the sleepwalkers lingered in the quiet folds of his mind. He understood that life often exists between moments, between words, between waking and dreaming, and those in-between spaces, he realized, are where empathy, patience, and quiet understanding grow. And somewhere, in that delicate, half-asleep world, the boy smiled softly, stretching just a little, letting his heart bend toward the rhythm of the town, the river, the lanterns, and all the quiet, persistent lessons that life had been teaching him. There was a garden tucked behind the leaning house, hidden from the casual eye, where memories grew like flowers. He discovered it one quiet afternoon, while wandering the edges of the village, following the soft hum of wind through the trees and the faint echo of whispers that seemed to carry meaning he could not yet grasp. The first thing he noticed was the scent, a gentle mix of earth, rain, and something faintly sweet like a lullaby remembered. The soil was dark and rich, tilled not by hands alone but by care, patience, and quiet attention. Each flower seemed to bloom not just from seed, but from memory itself. Some petals held names he had once heard and forgotten. Others carried moments he had lived long past but still tenderly present. He walked slowly along the winding paths, careful not to disturb the fragile shoots. Each step was deliberate, measured, like the rhythm of the river that had learned to listen, like the slow drift of lanterns through a patient night. And as he moved, he realized that the garden responded to him, bending toward his presence, leaning gently as if acknowledging a caretaker who understood its delicate needs. The first flower he tended had belonged to a neighbor who had left the village long ago. Its petals were pale and trembling, but when he leaned close, whispered a soft memory and brushed his fingers lightly over the soil, it straightened and glowed faintly in gratitude. The act was not one of magic, though it felt miraculous. It was an act of noticing, of remembering, of honoring what had once been overlooked. He spent hours in the garden, learning its rhythms. Some plants thrived in sunlight, while others preferred shadows. Some required careful water, while others simply needed the presence of someone who cared. He discovered that tending memories was like tending a garden. It demanded patience, attention, and a willingness to bend with the flow of life, never forcing, never demanding, simply allowing the natural rhythm to guide him. The garden became a place of reflection. Here he could remember those who had shaped him, the brother who stayed behind, the mentor who whispered his last lullaby, the silent friend, the quiet joys of the leaning house, the endless loaf of bread, the river that bent to his care. Each memory took root in the soil, blossoming as a flower that would not fade as long as he continued to visit, tend, and acknowledge its presence. He learned that some memories required patience more than action. A flower might seem dormant for weeks. Its leaves curled in quiet reserve until the right combination of care and attention coaxed it to bloom. He understood then that people too carried moments like this within them, sometimes hidden, sometimes overlooked, but capable of flowering when noticed, when gently nurtured. One afternoon, he found a small patch of wildflowers that had sprouted, though without intention. Their petals were uneven, their stems bending unpredictably. Yet when he knelt to examine them, he realized that they were memories of moments he had nearly forgotten. Tiny joys, fleeting gestures, small kindnesses that had slipped past his attention. By kneeling there, brushing soil gently from their leaves, whispering their stories aloud, he revived them, allowing them to bloom once more in the garden of memory. Sometimes the villagers passed by unaware of the garden's presence, but he saw them reflected in its blooms. A child's laugh became a sunburst of yellow petals. A neighbor's sorrow became a soft purple blossom. A moment of quiet love transformed into a delicate white flower that trembled like a candle flame. The garden, he realized, was a living archive of feeling, a place where life's subtleties could be honored and remembered without judgment, without hurry, without expectation. Even the river, which had always listened to his heart, seemed to find its reflection here. Tiny streams trickled through the garden, carrying water to each flower, twisting and bending like thoughts in a half-remembered dream. The boy would stretch his hands along the banks, coaxing the flow gently, guiding the water without imposing force, ensuring each bloom received what it needed to thrive. The interplay of river and garden felt like a conversation, subtle and persistent, echoing the lessons he had learned in the silent town of sleepwalkers and beneath the drifting lanterns. As the seasons turned, he observed changes in the garden that mirrored changes within himself. Flowers that had once struggled to bloom now opened boldly, vibrant and resilient. Others faded, their petals curling softly, leaving behind seeds that would carry memory forward to the next generation. He understood that this was part of the cycle, that even in letting go, care remained, woven into the soil and into the act of tending itself. The garden became a sanctuary not just for memories, but for emotions he could not always name. He would sit among the blooms, tracing stems with his fingers, feeling the tilt of the house behind him, hearing the river's quiet song, and allowing himself to simply be present. Here, in this cultivated stillness, he realized that the world could be a place of gentle repair, a place where hearts bent in care could nurture both the living and the remembered. Sometimes, he would invite the silent friend to join him. She would sit beside him, hands resting lightly on her knees, eyes tracing the curves of petals, and he would sense her presence as a mirror for his own attentiveness. Without words, they would tend the garden together, sharing the quiet communion of noticing, honoring and allowing growth to happen at its own pace. And in these moments, he understood that companionship could flourish in silence as profoundly as in speech. He came to see the garden as a bridge between past and future. Each flower, each memory, was a testament to what had been, but also a promise of what could continue to exist. In tending it, he learned that legacy was not only in grand gestures or dramatic moments, but in the careful, patient acknowledgement of what matters, in the bending of the heart to hold both joy and sorrow, presence and absence, love and memory. As evening settled over the village, casting long shadows across the garden paths, he paused to take in the full view. Flowers swayed gently in the wind, the river reflected the last light of the sun, and somewhere hidden in the folds of the leaning house, the mentor's voice echoed softly. The brother's memory shimmered faintly. The silent friend's presence hovered nearby. Everything was connected in subtle, persistent ways. He knelt one last time, brushing the soil around a small cluster of blooms and whispering a soft promise to return, to care, to bend without breaking, to listen to the garden's quiet needs as he had learned to listen to the world. And as he stood, stretching lightly under the soft twilight, he felt a calm satisfaction, a quiet exhale that spread from his chest into the evening air. The garden, he realized, was not just a place. It was a practice, a rhythm, a testament to the beauty of gentle attention. And in tending it, he tended himself, learning that care, empathy, and quiet love were as vital as any force the world might celebrate. And as night fell, he left the garden with the soft hum of memory in his chest, the leaning house cradling him from behind, the river flowing patiently, and the subtle awareness that all he had learned, the stretching, the giving, the listening, the presence, was blooming quietly, both in him and in the world around him. It began on a morning when the sky was a soft grey, the clouds leaning lazily toward the horizon, and the river reflected the muted light as if holding its breath. He had wandered farther than usual, past the leaning house, past the garden of forgotten names, and into a field where the grass swayed in gentle waves. There, among the wildflowers and soft murmurs of wind, he first heard her laugh. It was not loud or hurried. It did not demand attention. It fell like rain, steady and gentle, drumming softly on the leaves, the river, the backs of tall grasses. It drew him closer, as if the sound itself were an invitation, a subtle thread pulling him into a moment he had not anticipated, but had always needed. She stood there, brushing her fingers along the flowers, her eyes catching the scattered light, and he felt an unexpected warmth bloom inside him. There was nothing extraordinary in her appearance, no fantastical cloak, no glittering eyes. Yet the way she moved through the world, the softness of her presence, the effortless kindness in her gestures, was something profoundly rare. He hesitated, at first unsure if approaching would disturb the calm of the morning, but the laugh carried on the breeze seemed to notice him, to make space for him without words. And so he walked toward her, stretching his hand not to touch but to acknowledge, to reach across the quiet distance that had suddenly become familiar. "Good morning," he said softly, his voice blending with the rhythm of wind through the grass. She looked up, startled for a fraction of a moment, and then smiled, an ordinary smile, and yet it felt like sunlight after rain. "Good morning," she replied, and there it was again, the quiet fall of laughter, gentle and persistent, like droplets threading through the day. They spoke little at first. Words were unnecessary in the early moments of recognition. Instead, they shared glances, the bending of grass beneath their feet, the soft reflection of sunlight on the river, the faint hum of life that moved all around them. He noticed how she listened without needing to respond, how her eyes carried understanding, without pressing for it, and he realized that this quiet attentiveness was itself a kind of gift. Days passed, and each encounter unfolded like a delicate ritual. Sometimes they met by the river, sometimes in the garden, sometimes beneath the tilting house where the light leaned at just the right angle. He noticed small things, the way her fingers twitched slightly when she was thinking, the way her laugh could turn a shadowed moment into warmth, the way she seemed to notice what others missed without making a fuss. He found himself stretching. More in her presence, not in the literal sense, though that too, but stretching his heart to accommodate the gentle joy she carried. It was a lesson in presence and patience, in allowing someone's light to enter without overwhelming it, in giving space for laughter to fall like soft rain across the quiet rooms of life. One afternoon, she shared a small story about a flower she had tended in her own childhood garden, a flower she thought had been forgotten, yet had persisted. He listened, feeling the familiar pull of memory, the gentle echo of the mentor's whispers, the silent wisdom of the friend who answered without words. And in listening, he realized that love could be ordinary and extraordinary simultaneously, a quiet, enduring presence that neither demanded nor hurried. Their connection deepened, not through grand gestures, but through small intentional moments. Sharing a loaf of bread with a neighbor, tending a patch of wildflowers, observing the slow rise and fall of clouds, these became rituals of mutual understanding. He discovered that true closeness did not always need explanation. It required attention, patience, and a willingness to bend toward the other without losing oneself. Evenings were the most remarkable. The two would walk along the river, lanterns in hand, light reflecting on water that had learned to listen to his heart. She would laugh softly at something inconsequential, and he would feel the warmth of the world shift just slightly, tilting, toward a gentleness he had not known before. There was no urgency, no expectation, only the quiet unfolding of two hearts learning to inhabit the same space with care. He thought often of the mentor, the river, the endless loaf, the town of sleepwalkers, and the garden of forgotten names. Each had taught him patience, empathy, and quiet strength. And now the woman whose laughter fell like rain was teaching him another subtle truth, that love, when given with gentleness and attention, need not be loud or dramatic to be profound. It could enter slowly, like rain, softening the world, and, leaving it nourished. One evening, the clouds gathered low, reflecting the fading light. She turned to him, her laugh now a soft murmur in the hush of twilight, and he felt a clarity he had never known. Life's purpose, he realized, was not always in grand actions or dramatic turns. It was in moments like this, standing together in a field, feeling the pulse of wind, water, and shared presence, listening to laughter that fell like rain, understanding that to love was to notice, to attend, and to allow growth without demanding. He smiled, a slow, deliberate smile, feeling the rhythm of her presence blend seamlessly with his own. The soft exhale of the world, the river, the garden, the leaning house, and even the silent friend, seemed to converge in this moment, affirming that love could be gentle, steady, and profoundly transformative. That night, as he returned to the leaning house, he carried the warmth of her laughter in his chest, folded neatly alongside memories of his brother, the mentor's whispers, and the river's patient listening. He understood that love, like all the lessons he had learned, was best experienced in quiet, unfolding ways, in gestures both grand and subtle, in laughter that fell softly and without demand. And as sleep claimed him beneath the tilted roof, the sound of her laugh still echoed gently, like rain tapping on the edges of a window, a quiet, steady lullaby that would carry him into dreams, where the river, the garden, the lanterns, and every act of gentle care existed together in harmony. The child arrived one soft morning, when sunlight spilled through the leaning house in golden streams, tilting gently across the floorboards and dust motes that floated like tiny stars. He watched the quietness in their movements before he even recognized it as a gift. Unlike him, the child did not stretch in the same extraordinary way. Their limbs were ordinary, but their presence carried a subtle depth, a listening that felt like it could bend time itself. From the beginning, the child observed rather than spoke. They tilted their head, eyes following the drift of clouds, the path of lanterns, the ripple of the river. Even in silence, they seemed to absorb the world around them, noticing what others missed. The tilt of a flower, the quiet hum of the wind, the flicker of emotion in someone's gaze. He realized slowly that listening was a kind of stretching too, a soft and patient, bending toward understanding that required empathy rather than motion. The first morning together, he offered them a slice of the endless loaf, still warm from the oven. The child took it carefully, almost reverently, as though the act itself carried meaning. They bit into it and smiled faintly, but what struck him was not the smile. It was the attentiveness in their eyes, the way they watched the crumbs fall to the floor, the way they traced the warmth of the bread with their fingers before placing it back in their lap. He remembered the mentor, the river, the garden, the silent friend, and even the brother who stayed behind. Each had taught him that presence and care mattered more than action or words. And now he saw those lessons reflected in this quiet child, as if life had folded itself gently back into him and returned a reflection of all he had learned. He began teaching in subtle ways, not through instruction, but through example. Together, they wandered the garden of forgotten names. The child knelt beside each bloom, their tiny fingers tracing petals, their whispers brushing lightly against the flowers. The boy watched, a soft exhale leaving his chest, realizing that these small gestures were already lessons in empathy, in care, in bending without breaking. When he stretched, the child observed, tilting their head, absorbing the rhythm of the movement rather than attempting to mimic it. Sometimes they reached out a hand, gently guiding a stem back upright or brushing a leaf aside to let sunlight touch the bloom. And in that quiet guidance, he understood. The child had inherited not the physical gift of stretching, but the far subtler art of attention, of listening, of presence. Evenings became a ritual of quiet exploration. They would sit by the river, the child's legs dangling over the edge, eyes tracing the water's gentle flow. He noticed that their gaze seemed to reach beyond the visible surface, touching the reflections, the ripples, and perhaps even the echoes of memories that had gathered along the banks. In silence, he began to tell small stories, not loud adventures, not dramatic tales, but gentle observations of the river, the leaning house, the slow tilt of clouds, and the flowers' delicate sway. The child listened intently, not interrupting, not rushing, simply letting the words flow over them like soft currents. And he realized that this quiet, absorbing presence was a kind of gift he had never truly understood until now. The ability to witness, to honor, and to hold experience without the need to control it. One afternoon, the child wandered to the meadow, where time seemed to sit down in quiet grass. They knelt and pressed a palm to the soil, their tiny fingers following the curves of the land as if reading a map written in whispers. He knelt beside them, stretching lightly, and watched as they traced patterns in the dirt, patterns that spoke not of power, but of understanding. "I think they can hear the land," he whispered, mostly to himself. The child looked up, eyes wide but calm, and nodded slightly. No words were exchanged, but he understood their agreement. Listening was its own conversation. Presence, when true, needed no speech. It was in the bend of a finger, the tilt of a head, the quiet acknowledgement of what existed in a single moment. As the seasons turned, the child grew, still quiet, still attentive. Their attention transformed simple acts into small wonders, Folding laundry became a study of textures and warmth. Sweeping the floor became a meditation on patterns of dust and light. Carrying water to the garden became an exercise in gentle balance. Each act was ordinary and yet extraordinary in its quiet, deliberate care. He realized then that legacy did not have to be dramatic. It was not measured in the stretching of limbs or in grand displays, but in the careful imparting of empathy, attention, and patience. The child would carry these lessons forward, just as he had carried those of the mentor, the river, the brother, the silent friend, and even the woman whose laughter fell like rain. Sometimes, the child would sit in the garden of forgotten names, breathing in the scent of flowers, and he would stretch nearby, feeling a soft alignment between their presence and his own. They did not mimic him, but mirrored him in a subtler way, in stillness, in observation, in the gentle unfolding of awareness. And in that reflection, he felt a quiet exhale of satisfaction, a sense that life's rhythm continued, soft and unbroken. Nights were spent under the tilting roof of the house, the child curled beside him, listening to the river's song through the open window. Occasionally their fingers brushed against his, a quiet acknowledgement of connection, a gentle echo of the presence that had shaped him and now continued in them. Words were unnecessary. The silence itself was profound, carrying the warmth of shared understanding, the depth of inherited care, the subtle strength of quiet attention. He often whispered stories into the soft night, tales of lanterns drifting, of meals that never ended, of rivers that listened, and of flowers that held forgotten names. And the child listened, absorbing each word like a gentle current, letting it settle into the heart without urgency, without demand. It was not storytelling as performance, but storytelling as nurturing, as presence, as legacy unfolding quietly. In the next generation. In these quiet shared moments he recognized the fullness of life's lessons. He had learned to stretch, to bend without breaking, to give without expectation, to listen deeply, to honor memory, and to welcome love gently. And now, in the quiet presence of his child, he saw these lessons reflected, ready to continue their soft journey into the future. As the night deepened, he lay back, the child's hand still brushing against his own, and felt the gentle exhale of time itself. The house tilted softly around them, the river hummed in distant echo, the garden's flowers swayed in remembered rhythm, and the quiet child slept beside him, carrying forward the subtle art of listening that he had cultivated through years of care, attention, and love. And in that stillness he understood the enduring truth. Sometimes the greatest gift one can pass on is not a power or a skill, but the ability to notice, to care, and to listen, the soft bending of a heart toward life itself. The boy, now grown into a quiet man, walked along a stretch of beach where the tide met the sand in a slow, unhurried rhythm. The world was still, the sky a muted canvas of pinks and greys, and the soft lap of water against the shore seemed to carry the gentle pulse of time itself. In his hand, he traced patterns in the sand, imagining roads, rivers, and paths. But he did not follow them. He drew not for direction but for understanding, for the delicate act of mapping without need to arrive. He had long abandoned the notion that life demanded a fixed destination. His mentor had taught him that presence mattered more than arrival. The river had shown him that patience ripples farther than force. The garden of forgotten names had revealed that memories, when tended with care, could flourish in any soil. And now, standing at the edge of the tide, he realized that the sand itself offered a lesson in rhythm, impermanence, and gentle surrender. He knelt and began to draw again, this time a spiral that curved toward the horizon, looping back on itself in a continuous embrace. Each line pressed softly into the sand, each curve a reflection of the paths he had taken, through the leaning house, the town of sleepwalkers, the garden, the river, the laughter of the woman who had entered his life. And as he drew, he noticed the tide creeping closer, the water brushing at the edges of his map, erasing lines with soft, unhurried insistence. Rather than resist, he smiled. The tide's gentle removal of his work mirrored life's quiet lesson. Maps are guides, not commands. The lines we draw, the plans we make, the paths we imagine, all are temporary. What matters is not the permanence of the drawing, but the intention, the attention, the mindfulness that went into each curve, each mark pressed into soft earth dot. He wandered along the shoreline, watching the tide bend and curve around shells, stones and driftwood. He reached down occasionally, letting water wash over his hands, noticing the subtle patterns it left behind. In this repetition, this rhythm, he felt a profound peace. Life, like the tide, was a series of gentle motions, folding over itself again and again, offering new surfaces, new opportunities, new lessons, all without hurry, all without demand. As he walked, he found that the map he had drawn, soon washed smooth by water, had already served its purpose. It had guided not his steps, but his awareness. Each curve had taught him patience. Each line had reminded him that care and presence mattered more than reaching a particular endpoint. He realized that the act of drawing itself, of noticing the sand, the tide, the sky, and the subtle shifts of light, was its own journey. Further down the beach, he spotted his child, the quiet one who listened as if the world itself spoke in soft murmurs. They were tracing their own patterns in the sand, drawing loops and waves, small impressions that mirrored the rhythms of their thoughts. He watched, stretching slightly to bend closer without intrusion, and realized that the lesson of the map, of living by rhythm rather than destination, was being shared, quietly, wordlessly. "Maps can show the way," he said softly, kneeling beside them, "but they cannot give you the rhythm. That you have to feel." The child tilted their head, fingers tracing a spiral in the sand that curved in unexpected ways. He smiled, recognizing the same patience, the same gentle understanding that had guided him. In that moment, he understood that living by rhythm meant noticing the currents of life, following the slow bends of circumstance, and allowing the world to shape the path as much as one shapes it. They walked together along the shore, the tide, rising, soft waves curling at their feet, the sky slowly deepening into evening. He taught not by instruction but by example, stretching, bending, observing, listening. The child mirrored him in subtle ways, a careful step, a gentle reach, a quiet attentiveness to the motion of water and sand. And he saw that the legacy of bending, of patience, of presence, would continue quietly into the next generation. At one point, he stopped and drew a large circle in the sand, its edges blurring under the tide's gentle insistence. "Sometimes," he whispered, "the circle is enough. You don't need to go anywhere. The act of moving, of noticing, of being present, that is the journey." The child nodded, their small fingers pressing lightly into the sand, letting the water trace the edges, watching the lines disappear without alarm. They understood the lesson in a way words could never fully capture, that life's rhythm was not dictated by goals or destinations, but by the quiet flow of presence, attention, and care. As twilight fell, the man and child stood together, watching the horizon where sea and sky met in muted harmony. Lanterns from distant villages flickered faintly, and the river's earlier lessons of listening, patience, and gentle bending echoed in the pulse of the waves. He felt the tide not as a force to resist, but as a teacher guiding him, reminding him that living by rhythm was a continuous act of soft awareness, a stretch of the heart toward understanding the world as it was. Moment by moment, when night deepened, they returned to the leaning house, sand clinging to their fingers and feet, carrying the quiet satisfaction of a day spent in mindful presence. He tucked the child into bed, feeling the gentle exhale of time itself, and realized that the map in sand, though erased by tide, had served its highest purpose. It had shown him that life's guidance lies not in rigid plans, but in rhythms, flows, and the gentle bending of the heart to follow the world without force. He lingered at the window, watching the waves retreat and return, reflecting on the paths drawn and erased, and felt a deep, meditative calm settle into his chest. The map in sand was a reminder that impermanence could be beautiful, that surrendering to rhythm could be freeing, and that life's quiet movements, stretching, bending, listening, noticing, were as meaningful as any destination. And as sleep claimed him that night, he carried the rhythm of the tide, the lesson of impermanence and the quiet understanding that life was not about arrival, but about the gentle, mindful navigation of its unfolding paths. One evening, he stepped outside to find the sky unusually dark, a deep velvet without a single star. The familiar constellations he had traced so often, like gentle fingerprints across the night, were hidden beneath clouds heavy with quiet gloom. For the first time in many years, he felt a subtle unease settle into the space between his shoulders, a small weight pressing at the edges of his calm. He walked slowly toward the river, feeling the familiar tilt of the leaning house behind him, the quiet bend of the garden, awaiting his care. The world was still, but something within it, within him, seemed paused, suspended between certainty and doubt. He had walked many paths, tended many memories, loved and lost and stretched with care, yet now the night seemed to ask him a question. He could not immediately answer. What happens when the light you rely on is gone? The river greeted him with its usual gentle murmur, yet even its familiar hum seemed quieter, hushed beneath the weight of the starless sky. He knelt beside it, brushing his fingers across the surface, feeling the faint ripples respond to his presence. And in that response he realized that even when guidance feels absent, the world continues patient and persistent, waiting for the subtle touch of care and attention to awaken it. He thought of the mentor's whispers, carried like a lullaby through memory, of the garden of forgotten names, where even faded petals held stories, of the woman whose laughter had once fallen like rain, and of the quiet child, a new generation learning to listen without words. Each of these threads returned to him now, soft and insistent, as though reminding him that even when the night appears void, the light remains, tucked away in memory. Care and presence. The darkness above was vast, yet he did not rush, did not demand the return of stars. Instead, he walked slowly along the riverbank, noticing small glimmers of light reflected in the water, tiny echoes of moons and lanterns from distant houses. These hints of illumination reminded him that guidance need not always be bright or overwhelming. Sometimes the smallest flickers, soft, steady, subtle, were enough to navigate by. He leaned back against a stone, stretching slightly to feel the bend of his own body, the flexibility that had once seemed a novelty, but now felt like an extension of his heart. Each breath he took mirrored the river's rhythm, inhaling patience, exhaling doubt. Even in darkness he could feel the quiet pulse of life around him, the tilt of the leaning house, the faint hum of the wind through the garden, the gentle heartbeat of the child resting safely at home. A soft sound caught his attention. The laughter of the woman whose presence had once softened his days. Though she was not there, the memory of it shimmered in his chest, like a small lantern, steady and warm. It reminded him that light and love are often stored in subtle places, in memory, in habits of care, in the quiet stretches of the heart that bend without breaking. He began to walk again, each step slow, measured, absorbing the rhythm of earth beneath him, the sound of water alongside him. The absence of stars felt less oppressive when he noticed the small patterns of light reflected on ripples, on dew, on tilted leaves. Each shimmer became a guidepost, a gentle nudge to trust the journey even when the usual markers were hidden. Further along the bank, he encountered a small cluster of lanterns that had drifted from neighboring homes, their flames steady despite the dark. He lifted one, carrying it carefully, and as he did, he realized that even small gestures, lighting a lantern, tending a flower, whispering to a memory, could pierce the starless night with quiet illumination. Presence, care, and attention were themselves a kind of light, capable of bending the world toward hope. The quiet child appeared then, having wandered beside him, still observant, still listening. They did not speak, yet their small hand found his, a soft, grounding presence that reminded him of continuity, of the lessons that flowed from one generation to the next. Even in the absence of stars, even in the shadowed sky, the child's attentive gaze mirrored the same quiet understanding he had always sought, that life's rhythm persists, and that love and care are never truly absent. They walked together toward the leaning house, stretching lightly over the contours of the land, their steps in harmony with the river and the whispering wind. The darkness remained, yet it no longer felt threatening. Instead, it became a space for reflection, for noticing what had always been there. The quiet persistence of life, the echoes of memory, the gentle resilience of hearts attuned to care dot at the house. He paused, listening to the familiar creaks, the soft hum of evening settling. The garden of forgotten names swayed faintly in the night breeze, petals brushing one another in a rhythm only they understood. The river's edge shimmered with small reflections of lanterns, tiny points of light that seemed to gather in acknowledgement of his presence. Even the starless sky, heavy and velvet, seemed to hold a promise that darkness could not extinguish what had been nurtured with patience. He knelt in the garden, hands brushing over petals, remembering each memory he had tended. The brother who stayed behind, the mentor's lullabies, the endless loaf, the silent friend, the woman whose laughter fell like rain. All these echoes of presence and care became a constellation of their own, a map of light in a sky that appeared empty. He understood then that stars were not always necessary to navigate, as long as one remembered where to place attention, how to stretch toward understanding, and how to bend the heart with gentle patience. Night deepened further, and the child rested their head on his shoulder, fingers entwined lightly with his own. They breathed together, a shared rhythm that mirrored the river, the wind, and the subtle pulses of the garden. In that stillness he understood the quiet truth. Even when doubt visits, even when light seems absent, the rhythms we cultivate, the love we nurture, and the attention we give create their own illumination. He rose finally, stretching his body, fully under the dark sky, feeling the bend in his limbs, the soft exhale in his chest. The starless sky above no longer felt threatening. It had become another motif in his life, a reminder that darkness and uncertainty are as much a part of the world as light and clarity, and somewhere beyond memory and reflection, he felt the gentle pulse of the river, the sway of the garden, the echoes of laughter, and the attentive presence of the child, all weaving together into a quiet reassurance that life continues, softly, persistently, and with grace. And as he lay down that night beneath the tilting roof of the house, the absence of stars became a lullaby of its own, a rhythm to follow, a space to stretch into, a gentle encouragement that even the darkest nights are part of the pattern, part of the flow, and part of the lessons he had learned so patiently. The meadow stretched before him like a memory made tangible, soft and open, where the grass seemed to lean into the wind in gentle waves. He had come here often as a boy, following the drift of clouds, the whispers of the river, the quiet pull of curiosity. Now older and softened by years of experience, he moved among the tall stems with the careful awareness of someone walking through both the present and the past simultaneously. Time here felt different. It did not rush. It did not demand. It had bent and folded into itself, settling like dew on leaves, sitting in the curves of the earth, folding into the rhythm of his breath. He paused, hands brushing the tips of grass, noticing how each blade swayed independently yet together, a quiet choreography that spoke of patience, attention, and presence. He thought of all the paths he had walked, the leaning house, the garden, of forgotten names, the river that had listened to every heartbeat, the silent friend, the woman whose laughter fell like rain, and the quiet child who now carried forward the legacy of gentle attentiveness. Each step, each moment of bending, stretching, observing, had led him here to a meadow that felt like the embodiment of reflection itself. He lay down on the grass, letting it support him, its softness a reminder that sometimes the world meets us halfway, if we allow ourselves to pause. Above, clouds drifted lazily, their slow motion echoing the rhythm of his own thoughts, reminding him that reflection does not demand urgency. The sky, even with the occasional shadow of a cloud, seemed to lean down, a protective, patient companion. The river's murmur came faintly from the distance, carrying its familiar lullaby, a gentle reassurance that listening and caring ripple outward far beyond the immediate moment. He remembered the countless ways the river had reflected his own emotions, the subtle lessons of patience it had offered, and he felt the interweaving of life's small gestures, bending, giving, noticing, and letting go. He let his gaze wander across the meadow, noting each flower, each hidden insect, the tilt of the earth. It was here, in this soft expanse, that he felt the full sweep of love and loss, the quiet satisfaction of days spent stretching without breaking, giving without expectation, listening without judgment. The meadow seemed to cradle all of it, each blade of grass holding memory and care in gentle, unspoken acknowledgement. He recalled the times of doubt, the starless nights, the moments when guidance seemed absent. And now, reflected in the gentle sway of the meadow, he realized that even those moments had their place. They had taught him how to navigate without rigid maps, how to bend without breaking, how to cultivate empathy and presence when light seemed dim. The meadow, in its patient stillness, had always been a place to witness that flow. The child appeared then, quietly stepping through the tall grass, carrying the same calm attentiveness that had always been his own gift. They knelt beside him, their small hands brushing over blades of grass, feeling the contours of the earth, their eyes tracing the subtle movements of shadows and light. No words were needed. The shared silence was a communion of understanding, a reflection of all that had been learned and all that would continue. He reached over and took the child's hand gently, fingers intertwining, feeling the steady pulse of presence. The meadow responded in its quiet way, grasses swaying slightly more, flowers lifting their heads as if in acknowledgement, the distant river echoing their rhythm. He realized then that legacy was not a singular act or monument, but a gentle passing of attention, care, and empathy from one heart to another. As natural and persistent as the wind over the grass, memories came softly, one by one. The brother who stayed behind, whose absence had shaped him, the mentor who whispered lessons of patience and listening, the silent friend who had taught him the depth of unspoken understanding, the woman whose laughter fell like rain, infusing ordinary days with warmth, and the child, who now embodied the culmination of all these lessons, carrying forward the quiet, gentle art of presence. He allowed himself to stretch fully in the meadow, arms and legs reaching outward, feeling the ground, the wind, the slow rhythm of life beneath him. It was a stretching not of muscles alone, but of heart and mind, bending to accommodate the breadth of experience, the depth of love, the gentle awareness of time itself. As evening approached, a soft light painted the meadow in gold and lavender. Shadows stretched long and slow, echoing the rhythm of his breath, the bending of grass, the subtle pulses of all that had shaped him. He felt the interconnectedness of it all. Life, memory, love, presence and care, woven into a tapestry that needed no embellishment, no hurry, only attentive observation and gentle participation. He whispered softly, a lullaby for himself and the child, for the river, for the leaning house, for the garden of forgotten names, for the lessons of stretching and listening, for the tender love that had entered his life. The words, though few, carried meaning, acknowledgement, gratitude, and the gentle release of attachment to outcomes. The child rested their head on his shoulder, and he felt a quiet exhale of satisfaction, a soft closure of one chapter of life, while the rhythm continued unbroken. He realized that the meadow, like all the spaces he had tended, both physical and emotional, was a place to let time sit, to observe, to care, and to allow what was present to be fully honored. As the night deepened, the meadow became a space of reflection, of gentle goodbyes to the moments that had passed and of welcoming what would come. Each blade of grass, each flower, each whisper of wind was a reminder that presence matters more than permanence, that love matters more than recognition, that gentle attention can ripple farther than force. He lay back fully, letting the meadow cradle him, stretching one last time in awareness of all he had become, and all that would continue through the child and through memory. The world, quiet and soft, seemed to exhale alongside him, and he felt a deep, enduring calm. The roads stretched before him in quiet arcs, bending gently through hills and fields, leading nowhere in particular, yet inviting presence at every step. He walked slowly, noticing the sway of grass along the shoulders of the paths, the subtle play of light and shadow across the ground, the faint echo of wind weaving through trees. There was no hurry, no need to arrive. The journey itself was the rhythm, and every step was a soft exhale. He carried with him the echoes of his life. The voice beneath the static of the broken radio, the leaning house that had taught him balance, the river that listened, the endless loaf, the silent friend, the laughter of the woman who had once fallen like rain, and the quiet child whose presence was a living reflection of everything he had learned. Each memory was a note in a lullaby that had been forming over the years, a song that gathered itself in quiet cadence across moments and space. The road led him past familiar fields where wildflowers leaned toward the sun, past the gentle bends of the river, past lanterns that drifted lazily like slow, soft stars. Each motif of his life, a sound, a gesture, a memory, seemed to gather along the way as if the world itself were harmonizing, bending toward the melody of presence, care, and reflection he carried. Sometimes, he paused to listen. The hum of our distant village, the rustle of leaves in the wind, the gentle lapping of water at the riverbank. He noticed the way shadows stretched long and slow in the fading light, how the scent of earth and grass shifted with the breeze, how small birds tucked themselves into the folds of branches. Each detail became a note in the lullaby, each observation a reminder that the world, when noticed with care, sings softly to those who listen. The child walked beside him, fingers brushing his lightly, eyes following the rhythm of the road, the sway of trees, the subtle movements of light across the earth. They did not speak, for words were unnecessary. The silence itself was the language of attention, of love, of presence. He realized that this lullaby, like all he had cultivated in life, was less about sound and more about space, the space to notice, to bend, to witness, and to carry forward the quiet essence of being. He thought of the mentor, whose whispers had taught him the art of listening and patience. He thought of the silent friend, whose presence had shown him the depth of understanding without words. He thought of the river, the endless loaf, the garden of forgotten names, all of it weaving together into this soft procession of memory, as if the roads themselves had absorbed the lessons he had learned, and now offered them back as gentle guidance. The wind shifted slightly, carrying with it the faint scent of flowers, dust, and distant rain. The sound reminded him of the woman whose laughter had once fallen like rain, soft, persistent, steadying. It mingled with the subtle echoes of the child's quiet attentiveness, with the river's gentle murmur, and with the rhythm of his own breath, forming a chorus that felt like a lullaby sung across time and memory. He noticed the way the road curved, sometimes hidden beneath the tall grass, sometimes emerging into open fields. Each turn was familiar yet new, reminding him that life does not follow rigid maps, that paths can shift and change while the melody remains, that the rhythm of presence matters more than the destination. The child mirrored him in subtle ways, tilting their head to notice a flower, adjusting a step to follow the bend of a shadow, responding without instruction, only attentiveness. At one point, he paused at the edge of a small hill, looking back over the winding paths behind him. The road seemed to shimmer faintly in the last light, carrying the echoes of footsteps, of laughter, of whispered lessons, of quiet observances. He realized that these roads, like life itself, were a series of small acts, small attentions, small gestures that together form a song that persists quietly beyond recognition. He knelt then, brushing his fingers over the earth, tracing subtle patterns in the dust, letting the wind carry them away. Each movement was a note in the lullaby, a contribution to the quiet melody that life itself was offering, and the child watched, absorbing each gesture, learning not from words but from the rhythm of care, presence, and empathy that flowed naturally through his actions. As night began to fall, lanterns appeared along the distant roads, flickering softly like tiny stars planted by unseen hands. He felt a warmth in his chest, a sense that the world itself was responding to the quiet care that had been woven into it over time. Each memory, each gesture, each soft attentiveness returned now as gentle illumination, reinforcing the sense that life's melody exists in the rhythm of presence, not the drama of grand actions. He continued walking, feeling the tilt of the road beneath him, the pulse of the earth through his feet, the subtle weight of the day's lessons in his chest. The child walked beside him, their small hand brushing his, fingers curling gently around his, an acknowledgement of connection without words. Together, they moved through the paths, letting the roads carry them forward, while the lullaby, quiet and persistent, gathered around them like a soft blanket. At the crest of the hill he paused, gazing down at the winding roads, illuminated by the faint glow of lanterns and fading twilight. The patterns of light and shadow mirrored the rhythms he had learned over a lifetime. Stretches and bends, attentions and absences, presence and patience. He felt a profound exhale of calm, knowing that life's quiet melody could continue, uninterrupted, beyond any single moment or path. The child leaned against him lightly, and he leaned back, feeling the gentle pull of the world beneath them, the soft sway of earth, the quiet pulse of air and water and grass. The lullaby had gathered fully now. The river, the mentor, the silent friend, the woman, the endless loaf, the garden of forgotten names, all returning in gentle chorus, echoing softly beyond the roads, beyond the fields, beyond the tilting house and leaning sky. He stretched lightly one last time in the open night, feeling the rhythm of all that had passed, all that had been learned, and all that would continue. The lullaby, quiet and soft, folded around him and the child, a melody of memory, attention, care, and gentle presence. And somewhere in the quiet bends of the world, it continued to play, patient, unhurried, and full of gentle light. The morning arrived softly, without fanfare or urgency, sunlight spilling across the leaning house in gentle golds and pinks. Moved slowly through the familiar spaces, stretching lightly, feeling the subtle bend of his body echo the quiet lessons he had carried all his life. Stretching, he realized, had never been about strength or control. It had always been about flexibility of heart, the ability to yield without breaking, to bend toward understanding, to hold space for the world without forcing it to conform. The child followed, now growing into their own quiet presence, attentive and steady. They mirrored him not in the bends of the body, but in the patience of observation, the careful tilt of the head, the subtle acknowledgement that everything carried meaning if noticed with care. He understood fully, in this soft, wordless moment, that the legacy of bending, of presence, empathy, and attentiveness was not held in one person alone. It passed quietly, invisibly, from one heart to another. He remembered the river, which had taught him that emotions ripple farther than action, the endless loaf which had shown him that generosity need not diminish with use, the silent friend, whose quiet attentiveness had reshaped the way he listened, the woman whose laughter had fallen like rain, ordinary yet extraordinary. Each of these experiences was a thread woven into the fabric of who he had become, and now, through the child, those threads extended forward, continuing beyond his own lifetime. He wandered to the garden of forgotten names where flowers grew, in carefully tended chaos. Each bloom was a memory, a soft record of presence, care, and time. He knelt and ran his fingers lightly over petals, feeling the gentle bend of stems beneath them. And in that moment, he realized that bending, the literal stretching of limbs, the emotional stretching of patience, and the soft, persistent attentiveness to the world, was not a solitary gift. It was a language, a way to shape the world gently, and it could be passed forward quietly from heart to heart. The child joined him, kneeling beside the blooms, their small fingers tracing the shapes of petals and leaves. They paused for a long moment, head tilted, absorbing the rhythm of life around them. He did not instruct, there was no need. Their quiet presence was a lesson in itself, a living demonstration of the legacy of bending, of observing, of noticing, of opening the heart without demand, of being present without expectation. Together, they moved through the garden, tending the flowers with careful attention. The sun shifted, shadows lengthening, painting the petals and soil in soft gradients of light. The act of care, the gentle bending over each bloom, became a meditation, a quiet ritual of connection. Each plant, each leaf, each subtle detail carried its own story, and the child listened without words, Understanding the language of patience and presence that he had learned over decades, he thought of all the moments that had taught him to bend. The starless nights when guidance seemed absent, but subtle illuminations appeared in reflection and memory. The rivers, which listened to emotion and mirrored the depths of his own heart. The silent companionship of those who spoke little but understood much. Each had contributed to the gentle elasticity of his spirit, and now, through careful attention and shared presence, the child was inheriting that same ability. At the river, he paused to observe the water, tracing the way ripples spread with a slight touch of his hand. He smiled softly, feeling the familiar pulse of life that responded to care, patience, and attentiveness. The child watched closely, absorbing not only the movement of water, but the stillness in his own heart, the gentle stretching of patience, and empathy that had become second nature over years of quiet practice. He realized that the legacy of bending was more than an individual act. It was a cumulative force, a thread of subtle influence stretching across generations. It was the quiet, consistent acts of attention and care, the willingness to yield without losing integrity, the capacity to listen deeply and respond gently, that shaped the world in ways grand gestures never could. And in the child's presence, he saw the continuation of this force, ready to ripple outward in new ways, as unnoticed yet persistent as sunlight on the morning grass. They walked together to the meadow where time had once seemed to sit down. He stretched fully, arms reaching toward the sky, feeling the soft bend in each limb, the slow exhale in his chest, the alignment of body and heart with the earth beneath. The child mirrored him partially, their own presence bending subtly to match rhythm, showing that the essence of the legacy was not mimicry, but attunement. He thought of all who had come before, the small acts of kindness, the quiet attentiveness, the gentle resilience. And he understood fully that the true measure of his life was not the stretching itself, but the ability to pass it on, invisibly yet persistently, in gestures of care, attention, empathy, and patience. He felt an exhale of relief, of gratitude, of gentle pride. The gift was no longer his alone. It was alive in the child, ready to continue quietly across the unfolding days and years. Evening arrived, brushing the sky with muted pinks and purples. The child rested their head on his shoulder, fingers brushing lightly against his. He whispered softly, as if speaking to the wind, to the flowers, to the river, and to memory itself. The world bends softly when hearts bend softly. That is the gift we carry, and it continues, quietly, always. The meadow, the river, the garden, the tilting house all seemed to acknowledge the truth of the words, swaying gently in rhythm with the soft exhale of the day. He felt the connection of all things, a network of subtle presence and attentiveness, stretching infinitely outward through memory, gesture, and quiet observation. And in that network, he knew the legacy would endure, bending yet unbroken, soft yet persistent. He stood finally, stretching one last time in the fading light, feeling the gentle extension of limbs and heart alike. The child mirrored him partially, a small reflection of the quiet strength, patience, and empathy he had cultivated for decades. Together, they breathed with the rhythm of the meadow, the river, the wind, and the slow unfolding of life itself. And in that moment he understood fully. The legacy of bending is not about power or control. It is about the quiet, patient, persistent cultivation of presence, care, and empathy. It is the ability to stretch without breaking, to yield without losing integrity, to notice without interrupting, to love without demanding. It is a gift that, once nurtured, continues far beyond the life that first discovered it. He smiled, feeling the soft exhale of the world around him, the quiet pulse of the child beside him, the gentle acknowledgement of rivers, meadows, gardens, and skies. The legacy of bending had been passed, and it would continue, subtle, soft, and eternal. The night arrived softly, like a blanket laid gently over the world. The leaning house stood quiet, the garden of forgotten names humming faintly in the shadows, the river murmuring a lullaby only he seemed to hear. The stars blinked faintly above, each one a witness to the slow rhythm of his life. Yet he felt no need to reach them tonight. Tonight was for rest, for the gentle exhale of everything that had come before, for the quiet continuation of presence without effort. He moved slowly through the familiar spaces, stretching lightly, each bend of his body a reflection of decades, spent learning how to yield without breaking. He remembered the boy who had once heard a voice beneath the static, the quiet child who had mirrored him in attentiveness, the mentor who had whispered lessons of patience, and the woman whose laughter had fallen like rain. Every memory, every echo, every gentle gesture of care settled into him like soft feathers, adding to the rhythm of his breath and the sway of his heart. The child followed at a small distance, eyes reflecting the dim light, fingers brushing the folds of grass and petals, absorbing without interruption the quiet lesson of presence. They had walked together through rivers, meadows, gardens, roads, and the starless sky, each step a continuation of the same gentle rhythm he had discovered long ago. And now, as night deepened, the rhythm reached its quietest, most luminous cadence, a final stretch before the rest that was not an end, but a transformation. He lay down in the meadow where time had once seemed to sit, the soft grass curving beneath him like an embrace. He stretched his arms and legs slowly, deliberately, feeling the bend of body and heart alike, the subtle pulse of breath flowing in harmony with the river, the garden, and the leaning house. Each exhale released decades of movement, memory, and care. Each inhale drew in the quiet presence of all that remained, all that mattered. The child settled nearby, observing the gentle rise and fall of his chest, learning in silence the art of bending without breaking, of yielding without surrendering. There was no instruction, no lesson beyond presence itself. The child's awareness was the living echo of all he had practiced, a quiet reflection of the legacy he had nurtured. And he felt in that silent communion that the gift of bending, of stretching into empathy and patience, had reached its fullest expression. He thought briefly of the endless loaf, the silent friend, the rivers that had listened, the garden of forgotten names, the roads that had wound endlessly, and the starless sky that had once pressed upon him with doubt. Each of these motifs gathered gently in his mind, weaving together a final melody of remembrance. They were not burdens nor demands, but soft guides, each a note in the lullaby of his life. The night deepened further, drawing a soft curtain across the meadow. Fireflies blinked slowly, lanterns floated from distant windows, and the wind carried a faint whisper through the trees. He stretched one last time, fully, limbs and heart reaching toward the sky, bending into the rhythm of the world. Rather than resisting it, he felt a profound release, a quiet exhale, as if the universe itself recognized the patience, care, and attention that had been woven into every day of his life. He closed his eyes and listened. The river's murmur, the sway of grass, the distant laughter of a memory, the quiet breathing of the child, the soft pulse of stars overhead. He felt the connection of all things, the delicate interweaving of moments, gestures, and presence that had shaped him, and now stretched outward beyond the bounds of a single life. Each breath was a thread, each heartbeat a note, each gentle stretch a continuation of a quiet, persistent song. The child leaned against him lightly, and he felt a calm exhale ripple through the space between them. He whispered softly words, carried like feathers on the wind. The world bends gently when hearts bend gently. Stretch into it, yield, listen, care, and it continues. No answer was needed. The quiet attentiveness of the child, the rhythm of the river, the sway of the grass, and the soft hum of night were acknowledgement enough. He felt the bending in his body and heart converge into a single, serene motion. It was not an end, not a conclusion, but a transformation into the subtle rhythm of the world itself. He became, for a fleeting, eternal moment, fully present, fully stretched, fully yielding to the quiet pulse of life. His stretch carried him, outward and upward, not as an act of leaving, but of merging with the gentle flow of all things. The stars blinked above, faintly shimmering in acknowledgement, while the meadow, the river, and the garden held the imprint of his presence in soft, imperceptible ways. Even in the absence of words or grand gestures, the legacy of bending, of stretching into care and empathy, had taken root, ready to ripple outward quietly through the child and all who would observe, notice, and extend the same gentle attention. He felt the night embrace him, the pulse of the world synchronizing with the rhythm of his breath. And in that soft exhale, he realized that life, like stretching into the stars, is not about endings, but continuations. Quiet, patient, persistent, and full of gentle presence. He lay there, fully stretched, fully present, fully at peace, knowing that the world itself held the rhythm he had learned to inhabit. Somewhere the child would continue. The garden would sway, the river would murmur, the roads would bend, and the memory of stretching, yielding, and observing would ripple onward quietly, softly, persistently. And with that, he stretched into the stars, not vanishing but becoming part of the night sky itself. And if you look closely, you may still see him, a little bend in the heavens, a quiet reminder of gentleness. Thanks for spending this time with us. Sleep well. Everything's going to be okay, man.